All right, we are recording. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. If not, feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here and we will get started. All right, is everybody able to see that screen all right that says service design for product designers? All right, I'm seeing heads nodding. That is good. Well, cool. Well, I appreciate everybody joining today. And for those of you in person, welcome to the studio science space. It's really good to see people in that space. I really wish I could be there in person myself. I was planning on it and then came down with a cold this weekend and did not want to share that with you all. So sad to be there, sad to not be there with you all. That said, you know, as a second, a plan B for being there in person and connecting with you all. If anybody would like to connect, feel free to you know, shoot me a text if I know you, or if I don't know you, reach out to me on LinkedIn. We'd be happy to connect and chat more. For those of you that I haven't met, like Bobby said, I am Justin Zalewski. I'm the Director of Product Strategy and Design at Studio Science. Hope everybody's having a good Indy Design Week. Today, we are going to talk about service design for product designers. And before I get started, I just want to note that I'm not going to try to draw or redraw the differences between product design, UX design, CX design, interaction design, service design, all these different labels that we use. There are differences, but I think it'd be tedious and unproductive for us to talk about that today. Or if anybody's interested, we could use some of the Q&A discussion time at the end to talk about these. Totally up to you. So for today's discussion, I'm going to use the term product designer just to mean a designer that's working on a company's digital product. So they typically work on, or at least with, the product team at the organization, but their title might be product designer, UX designer, interaction designer, any variety of things. What I am going to talk about is how product designers can benefit from incorporating a service design approach and skill set into their work. So let's start here. What is service design? This can be a little confusing because there are a lot of different definitions for service design. It's a less mature discipline. It's a little bit newer. And so it's still kind of being formed. But I picked out a couple of my favorites. So this one from LiveWork I really like because it recognizes that service design is the application of processes and skills that are already established. These aren't introducing new kinds of skill sets into the work. It's the application of these existing skill sets and processes to the development of services. And also this one from Bridget Madger, where she recognizes that service design is all about choreographing these processes, technologies, and interactions. So it's not that we need to entirely design or invent what these processes, technologies, and interactions need to be, although in some cases we do, but really the role of service design is to orchestrate these kinds of things. And the second half of this I like just as much, which is all about the co-creation. So we're not in any kind of paternalistic way saying we as designers know best. Service design, and again, this isn't a unique thing to service design, but service design emphasizes the importance of co-creation with our relevant stakeholders. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Point of this talk is that we should shift from a product mindset to a service mindset when we are designing things that are actually services. A lot of today's digital products are not just tools that people use, they are services, sometimes purely digital services, but services nonetheless, designed to meet the needs of customers along some kind of journey. So we could think of Airbnb as a great product or a great app, but Airbnb is a service. Airbnb serves their customer along the various stages of their vacation journey, from the initial planning and browsing to messaging back and forth with the host and travel and prep, all these different stages along the journey. Even on the B2B side, we could think of DocuSign as a product, but DocuSign is also a service. DocuSign serves their customers along the journey of getting a deal done. Now, because today's digital products are more like services than they are products, product designers can be more effective by using a service design approach. This is going to help us evaluate and design improvements by looking at the holistic experience rather than simply the product touch points. And we'll talk more about that. If there's one thing you take away from the talk today, I want us to remember that so often a clickable prototype alone is not enough. Our beloved clickable prototypes are usually the artifact and the point of focus for product designers today, and not entirely without reason, right? They are so much easier to produce now, and we have so many more tools than we used to, from Figma, Sketch, XD, Framer, what have you, although Figma is clearly the best option. Most of the teams that we work with spend the majority of their time and focus and budgets on the most visible parts of the experience. So the designing these very visible parts with a clickable prototype makes a lot of sense in that way, right? But here's the problem. When we stop at the clickable prototype, we ignore some of the most important elements of a service, namely the space between the touch points and what's required to make that service a reality: the people, processes, systems that support the customer experience. Now let's talk about each of those. So the space between the touch points. What is happening with your customers when they're not looking at the screens that you've designed? This can change their context, their needs, their goals. So how that experience feels to the customer as it's experienced in reality, not just as a touch point in a vacuum, is really important to measure, to iterate on, and to test. Clickable prototypes make it really easy to ignore this because they're focused on a linked series of screens rather than the reality of that person's experience, which can occur over channels and time. So to account for this, we need to prototype across channels and across time. And this can be difficult, right? But here's two ways to think about it: direct experience versus indirect imagination. So direct experience, meaning people can use the prototype in a way that lets them experience it for themselves, and indirect imagination, where people can imagine the intended experience. And as you might imagine, it's not totally binary. There's all kinds of gray area between the two, but think of these as two parts of a spectrum. So direct experience is the closest to reality. And so this is ideal whenever possible, but oftentimes this can take a little bit longer. And so there are plenty of good reasons to use indirect imagination as well. So let's jump into a couple quick examples just to get more specific. So for one of our clients, and some of this will be general due to NDAs, but for one of our clients, we co-designed a pilot program with the employees at the organization that would be responsible for supporting this new service that we were designing. The pilot program had the participants test that newly designed service over the course of a week. We had daily feedback prompts, personal check-ins from our team at key points. And so in this situation, we're able to still limit risk because it's still a small group of participants. We're not rolling this out across the entire company, but we're able to learn from a much more real situation because the participants don't need to imagine what it's like to incorporate this new process into their existing work. They're going to actually try it out over the course of a week and let us know as it goes what's working, what's not. So we can really quickly learn at the end of that week from what went well and what needs to be adapted before we roll this out to a larger group. Now contrast that with an indirect imagination example. Actually, for that same client, we ran through a situation where we weren't able to line up a pilot program because of time constraints of the participants, but we were able to set up specific scenarios in a moderated user test that helped those participants understand and provide feedback on multi-channel service that be experienced over time. So specifically, we're able to ask them to open a clickable prototype, in this case, that had them open up an email. And so we were able to have them click through like you do in a clickable prototype and complete registration for an experience. But at a certain point, we needed them to use their imagination and say, all right, put yourself in this scenario. Now it's been a week since you went through that initial part. You sit down at your desk, you open up your email, and you find this new message here that's asking you to move on to this next part of the process. So even though it's indirect, we were still able to uncover insights about how those gaps in time would affect the experience for them and how we could adjust it to better meet their needs. So even with that indirect imagination approach, with intentional framing, of those situations, we're able to get them to imagine that more directly. The second part of what clickable prototypes make it really easy to ignore is what's required to make that service a reality. We see a lot of organizations trying to improve customer experience by designing the touch points across the end-to-end journey that they believe will better serve their customers' needs. Nothing wrong with that, right? The problem is that these initiatives are usually one-sided and they fail to account for the complete system supporting the customer experience. In service design, we refer to that as the backstage of a service. So the people, processes, and technologies required to enable that customer experience. And what happens when ignoring the backstage is you risk a few things. So one, a failure to implement the intended experience. I'm sure a lot of us have run into this before as well, if organizational roadblocks along the way. When assumptions are made about the capabilities of an organization, it hugely increases the risk along the way that you run into some kind of obstacle along the way of the team responsible for implementing the solution saying, hey, this needs to pull data from this legacy CRM and it's just not going to work, or well, hey, that requires this other department and they're already way overloaded. So the more we can map that out ahead of time and coordinate the front stage and the backstage of the experience, the more we can de-risk that and find paths forward rather than running into those frustrating organizational roadblocks. The second risk is that failure to deliver the intended experience. So potentially even worse than the first, if an experience gets launched and delivered to customers, but can't actually make good on its value promise, it has a huge risk to the organization's reputation, to the overall customer experience that the organization is providing. And third, if a poorly planned solution is implemented, it could burden the team that's tasked with delivering that service. This is especially timely right now. We hear a lot about what the employee and worker experience is in organizations, unrealistic expectations. And oftentimes that could be the result of a poorly planned or poorly orchestrated service. If leadership is driving forward a vision for a customer experience that's not aligned with the reality of the employee experience, then no amount of training, employee engagement initiatives, fancy perks is going to address that root problem of unrealistic demands. So as the design team, we can be a part of bringing people together and aligning those expectations. Now, a quick backstage consideration example. We're working with a client of ours on a customer adoption problem. They had built a really robust digital product that was designed to help employees follow their proprietary process, but people weren't using it. And so we mapped the service blueprint along the customer journey, identified where the design of the service was misaligned with the reality of their employee experience. No surprise there, right? But what was surprising was we found there were other departments trying to tackle that same problem as us through different one-sided solutions. So we had one of these moments here. We're like, hey, platform team, you're also trying to figure out why nobody's using the service or here, albeit kind of from more of a technical angle than us from a design research angle. But when we had that realization, we were able to realign the departments around one common goal, one holistic approach, and save the client months of time and effort and frustration. Now, many of us are maybe already leveraging a service design approach, even if we don't call it by that name. But if we're not, here are two places I'd recommend starting. So first, I'd recommend building relationships, both internal and external. Internal being with other departments, with your team, if those are not already strong. And external being with people outside your organization. So third parties that might support that solution. You might find when you're mapping out what a solution requires that some of these capabilities that the customer experience is dependent on rely on people outside your organization. So build relationships with those stakeholders in the process. And second, mapping your service with a service blueprint. Service design isn't all about the service blueprint, but it's a really helpful tool. And one way to think about it is this, and happy to talk more about this as much as is helpful. But a lot of us will be familiar with mapping the customer journey, right? And so one way to think about the service blueprint is to map out what is the backstage that we can add to that visualization that can make it clear what that customer journey depends on. I would recommend giving this a shot. I think you'll be surprised what kinds of insights this leads to when you can see all the different parts of the organization that are required to support each stage of the experience. So to bring it all together, to think of a service design approach and how we can apply this to our work as product designers, we need to be considering the experience more holistically. We need to make sure the service addresses the needs of all stakeholders through the entire service. We also need to think, instead of touch points, think about the journey. So services are sequential. When we can visualize this, for example, in a service blueprint, and design the interactions at each stage, this is going to help us design a service in the way that customers actually experience it. And then finally, co-creating that solution with internal and external stakeholders. I'm sure a lot of us are already co-creating with decision makers within the business, and hopefully also members of the target audience, but also involving the people that are required to make that service a reality. And so if your new service or new experience that you're designing requires marketing to play some new part, requires customer service to play an additional role, making sure that you involve them in the design process, bringing their insights into it and bringing them on board along the way. That is all I've got for us today. I'm going to stop it there, and then let's open it up for some questions. All right, and I'm going to stop the screen share here so we can all see each other's faces.
Hey, Justin. Oh, sorry. I don't know how we're gonna go. We have a question here. Sure,
Okay.
you can come up here.
And Lorraine, I heard y'all call you next.
Yeah, so the camera's right here.
Being a nerd. Hey, Justin, what's up?
Hey, Jamie, good to see you.
It's been a minute.
Yeah, it has.
So I've got a bunch of questions.
All right.
Service blueprints, one of my faves. You raise an interesting point about there's gaps in time across the journey that the digital products may not be able to account for. Is that something that your team tries to take into account when putting together a blueprint? And if so, how have you addressed those time journey aspects that aren't inclusive inside the product?
Yeah, so let me know if I'm hearing you correctly. So along a experience, for lack of a better term, there may be some parts of the experience that the digital aspects of a product cover and touch, and some that don't, right? Yeah, typically we are identifying those when we map the current state of the service, which, a common situation we see, and I imagine you might have seen this as well, is that a goal of the client is to move to maybe a more digitized version of a service, something that's maybe more self-service. Maybe it's like a digital transformation initiative. So where the current state might have more analog parts of the service, they're looking to meet those needs in more digital ways in the future state. And so that's where figuring out, all right, in this current state, we've got all these parts where there's, paper forms, call centers, these kinds of things. In the future state, how could we address that in different ways?
Okay.
Does that kind of get what you're getting at?
I know what you're getting at. Yes, I was curious to see how you guys are approaching it, because the problem is real, right?
Yeah.
My next question, if it's okay, you talk about bringing in multiple teams or work streams into the process, right? Super on board with that, right? I'm curious to know your approach to that, meaning if you have, let's say, a working session to work through a potential workflow with marketing team, because you want to leverage their expertise, but you don't want to ignore product teams or production teams, or even business stakeholders, the ultimate ones that make the decision. Are you more apt to try to include all of the teams in co-working sessions, or do you prefer to address it separately with each team and then maybe do a playback with the totality of what you've discovered with everybody?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is honestly the hardest part of it all. It's just, organizational stuff, right? The ideal, but I realize this is a bit utopian and this hardly ever works out, is I think what you recognize there of, working with a dedicated group that represents different areas of the business, and you're all, everybody's representing different perspectives, working together at the same time. But this hardly ever matches reality. It's really difficult to bring all the relevant people together at the same time. And so what most often is required just to get things forward and to make even incremental progress is we typically have a core team, and as varied of perspectives as we can have around that core team, the better. We recognize it might be, hypothetically, let's say we've got sales and revenue and marketing and product and customer service represented here in this core team, and that's great. But the what's a department I didn't name? Let's say the warehouse, they're just going to be, they're super swamped. They're really difficult to get a hold of. So we're going to need to do these kind of satellite sessions with them to, check in, get their perspective at key points and bring that in to the main group. Typically some kind of compromise like that ends up being made just due to the realities of calendars in large organizations,
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. It's good seeing you.
You too, man.
I'm going to jump in with the next question, Justin.
Yeah.
What is, and I'm hoping you'll get so real here. What is the hardest part about service design for you? Where do you get tripped up? Because I know it can get messy. Like there's a methodology, you can have all the best laid plans, but it's humans and there's a lot of variables there, right? And so what do you find, what have you found so far is the messiest, trickiest part of doing service design work?
Yeah. Had Jamie not asked that question just before you, I probably would have said bringing the full group of people together is probably the most difficult part. But I'll say the other most difficult part is, I'll say dealing with maybe even more than dealing with the ambiguity, but setting expectations with the ambiguity with key stakeholders. They want to see certain amounts of progress at key milestones, and that can be set, right? But it is impossible to set any kind of meaningful milestones and project plan like it would be with a more defined, zoomed in deliverable, if that makes sense. And so dealing with that kind of movement takes the right mindset in an organization, and that can be just as difficult to get people on board with as it can be to just align siloed departments and busy calendars in that aspect.
Do you have an example of how you've worked through that? Or facilitated that difficulty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it all comes down to I think having allies and champions within the organization that can help to get the ball rolling within that. I think it's really difficult for one person or even a small team to affect that kind of mindset change in an organization. But if you've got people you can win over in different areas of the business that can kind of speak to that, if you're working with the revenue team, the sales team, and there is one member there that you've built a little bit of a relationship with and know that, you know, they get where we're coming from. They can be kind of the key to unlocking, you know, a more productive relationship with that department or that area of the business. I would also say to set realistic expectations for ourselves, that especially in a large established organization, that change is slow and difficult a lot of times. And so to start small. I read a good quote the other day. I'm not going to forget it's the name of, there's some law, some like psychological principle. And it's something like any successful complex system evolved from a successful simple system. And so never start by designing a complex system. And if anybody knows the name of the law that I'm referencing, help me out. Yeah, I think that can be applied in a variety of ways. It really resonated with me because I think it's really easy in our work to see the complexity and want to design a complex system to accommodate it. But to realize that to affect change, we need to be iterative, and oftentimes we have to start small.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Can I ask a question to you know, anyone willing to answer and just jump into the discussion? Has anyone put these kinds of principles into practice in their work, maybe even specifically within a product design part of the organization? And you know, what are some things that you've learned? And if nobody wants to answer that, I'd be happy to take another question.
Your question was how does somebody successfully expand their organization?
Sorry, Bob, I'm having a hard time here. Were you just asking me to restate the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I was curious if anyone has tried to put a service design approach, a service design mindset into practice within their organization, within their work, and what they've learned from that. You know, what went well, what was a challenge?
Oh, Nikki?
Yeah, so hi, Nikki Livingston. I used to work with Indy School of Medicine, and I help specifically with a typical like software product. But as you can imagine, we have like an ERP and lots of different systems that talk to each other. And my professional background is in communications, and so I kept noticing some similar challenges that we were having between not only just the tech, but also how we were reaching our audiences. So what we ended up doing was kind of getting it around with a bunch of sticky notes, talking about what the process looks like from our perspective. And we had myself there, we had someone from DEI, we had ERP folks, and then we had, you know, the director of operations and some IT people who won't let us buy certain products that, that we don't like to use.
Electronic records.
Oh, no, ERP is like enterprise, oh gosh, it's like enterprise resource planning or something like that. But what they, for our sake, ERP was kind of the tech bridge between like payroll, HR technology, communication tech. It was like this cross feed of how do we use different technical systems between like Oracle for records and like Kronos for timekeeping and et cetera, et cetera. And they're supposed to kind of be the center of how do we have a experience that's easy for someone to go from like new hire, have all their tech ready, feel successful in their job, but then kind of navigate and maintain all the information and records that they need through there's like professional development goals. And of course, whenever there's a payroll problem, it's like, do you call the tech people or do you call HR? So we all kind of got in a room and threw a lot of sticky notes on the wall to try to figure out the gaps and what we were missing from each other and who should own, you know, what should be a system communication versus what should be like something officially from the HR people. So anyway. Very much trying to think through like the service experience, but not necessarily narrowed in on a particular product, just how our products work together.
Yeah, that, and I mean, that's ERPs of any sort are complex and big, and it can be really difficult to work with, especially if it's been, you know, embedded in an organization for a long time. Well, that's awesome. What I mean, what do you what were some of your big takeaways from that?
I think some of our big takeaways were confusion around like who owned the touch point with the customer. So there were some things that I think our ERP was young at the time, so maybe 3 years, that they had kind of taken over, where I think some of our clients were kind of like, well, I don't think that should be a system message. I think we need to have more of a, you know, human touch, or at least like a signature, or, you know, so thinking about, so I think that was one thing that hadn't really been thought about before, was how do we have all these systems, but still make it feel like there's a human on the other side that cares about making sure you get your extra shift incentive bonus for working overtime, you know, throughout COVID. So getting some more of that human voice back in, I think, was one big takeaway.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
Like kneeling down like a moron. So yeah, so the company I currently work for, we've done a few things. So I don't know within bounds of service design, but we entered into a very big engagement to look holistically look at one, user demographics, interactions with our products and services. And when we kicked that off, we established cadence for business canvas from the stakeholders, for the main business and stakeholders. Then we also did team canvases for each workstream team, so support, IT, product. We also had those teams write up proto personas for us, because we could make a lot of assumptions on this particular user group. But that helped us uncover a number of touch points that we weren't aware of, that we would have been able to tease out through all the processes, right? But at the beginning, so this was within the first month. So within the first, and I know that's luxury of time, fair enough. But you know, within the first month doing that, we knew business goals and opportunities from the business canvas. From each team work stream, then that helped us when looking at service blueprint, where they connect and where they felt they needed to connect, or where they felt they needed to connect with other teams. Having them write up at least the initial proto personas, again, very you know, confirmation bias and all that stuff, but at least it established areas that we could pursue when going to end users for deeper exploration on their path. So that helped us start down the path of what is the goal for this engagement? Because when the stakeholders came to us, it was the make it 20% cooler kind of approach, right?
Yeah.
And it helped us, instead of having to do rounds and rounds and rounds of individual sessions or our own exploration with just the users, then going back for us, starting on that aspect of going really heavy business side, product side before touching the users, at least helped us establish where we needed to explore when we got to user interviews and prototype testing. So that was our approach in that project. It seems to have worked pretty well. It also helped with the business alignment, to your point about making sure all the various potential players can have insight into what you're doing, knowing that we were talking to like the support team. So the IT infrastructure team said, hey, when you talk to support, get on their case because they're not doing whatever it is. It's like, that's not our circus, but we'll bring it up, right? And then, one other thing that has helped us in this is bi-weekly, we call them playback sessions, but research readouts, product readouts, project readouts, right? And that's been important because we've invited everybody that's been either in the business or team canvas or stakeholder or anybody in the company that's been in the process to see where we are and what we're doing. And that's helped us on a few different fronts. One, it's helped us stay on point with the work we're doing with the business. But two, from a company culture standpoint, it's helped to sort of organically evangelize the work that my team is doing without having to do like a new deck to road show out whatever you're calling it does, getting that. So, but that's just been our approach to kicking off projects. And there's project plans and other garbage or stuff, important things to do, but yeah, that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's such a great point too of how to make progress in the mindset of an organization. And like you said, without needing to create a formal presentation roadshow deck, to just show examples and use storytelling of here's how this has already been working.
Yeah, the team canvas really helped out. That was an approach that I hadn't used previously on projects for no reason other than just didn't. But using that at the kickoff of this project really helped each team that we would eventually be talking with, or eventually be either working with or giving out effort to, feel like they're part of the conversation. And also, again, selfishly gave us insight that we wouldn't have had for several weeks.
So what framework is the team canvas?
So the team canvas would be more like in customer experience stuff.
Okay.
But it's no different than like lean canvas or business canvas. It's really, you go to the team and you ask them, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What areas do you work on? What areas do you see improvement on? And what touch points do you have with the customer? Basically, those are the 5 domains you ask them about, because then that gives you potential persona insight. It gives you potential workflow insight. It gives you potential pain and opportunity insight before having to do really deep user assessment, which is the key. User is the key, but it just helped us jumpstart this particular project. And it was like a real sticky wicket with like different stakeholders that didn't really want to talk to each other. And it's like, we're not getting in the middle of that garbage. So we're just going to be like the typical middle person, right? But yeah, I can give you a template later. Actually, I think if you use Miro, I think there might be a team canvas template in there. The business canvas that we use, I think, is the default Miro template. But that was helpful for us to understand the business stuff, because we didn't understand, because the business would come in us with saying, again, make it 20% cooler, but if we don't know where like revenue generation is, or where they feel there's an opportunity in the market space, which is obviously the low service design, they just helped us make that assessment. But yeah, Poppy, I can get you later.
Is it the business model canvas popularized by, is it Strategizer or whoever kind of has
Yeah.
that? Okay, yeah, cool.
You know what I'm talking about, because it's similar to the lean canvas. It's like a canvas of things, right?
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
helps studify. And I think we might have made one adjustment to the questions that the business canvas asked, but it was specific for the project that we needed to dive into a little bit. It wasn't necessarily like business stakeholder stuff, but it's been that approach has just helped us in our instance, because we've beaten our heads against the wall and other methods like we all have. Right. And this worked this time. Next project will be some other different, they'll want a design sprint day 2, and it's fine, or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, that's my story.
Awesome. Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem.
I really like this rolling experience. I feel like I'm on one of those like rolling iPads or something, like I'm a surrogate.
Yeah, you're kind of walking around the room.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for giving this talk. I love the concept of the backstage. And so when you presented that slide, my mind kind of went to, especially for larger clients, kind of all the ancillary platforms that may or may not support a customer journey, or I guess I should say a user or customer may or may not end up on. And so I love the idea of not ignoring that, like I said, specifically for larger clients, how do you go about tackling, a lot of these, I'm thinking like these kind of ugly third-party platforms, sometimes which you or your team or nobody really knows how they ended up with the company or how, those decisions get made, but they're, I'm thinking like knowledge-based things or like support or file a support chat via email that you may or may never hear from. Kind of like those kinds of things that may end up as part of the customer journey if something goes awry or something like that, but you may not have had any control over, and those kinds of things. Like, how do you go about tackling that and prioritizing and convincing the company that this is even part of the customer journey worth exploring?
Right. Yeah. So I think A couple of things come to mind there. One, because we are the orchestrators of this kind of thing, we don't necessarily need to be in charge of that platform. Like you said, we're oftentimes we're not the ones that chose that. We don't necessarily need to be the ones that do that, but we might still need to highlight if this is a big problem area. Mapping out that experience can be a great way to highlight that. For example, if the whole point of the work is to improve the customer experience, and if by mapping out the current state, we can see, all right, as soon as they have an issue and they need to go to the knowledge base or to the customer support portal, this is when things go south. This is when there's all kinds of technical issues because the platforms we had to date. This is where we've captured this feedback from interviews with customers that they feel like they're in the wrong place because this thing isn't on brand. It doesn't even look like they're interacting with the same organization anymore. That's where you can use that current state to represent, all right, we care about the customer experience, and this is the point in that journey where it goes bad.
So we're just sort of trying to go back to the usual tried and true, just capturing, user feedback and user experience and trying to document what's going on here and try to build a case.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, also keeping that backstage in mind, maybe it's not only affecting the user experience, maybe there's internal teams where this is a huge headache for them as well, and figuring out like, hey, is this whole thing increasing the time that you all need to spend tackling tickets by 20%? What would it look like? What would we stand to gain by moving off of something? That's where you can talk with these internal teams that might never have been connected before in figuring out what could a potential future state look like that might not just benefit the customer, but benefit how you all do your work as well. Cool. Yeah, sorry, I know that it was kind of an all over the place kind of answer, but I know what you mean. It's tough to figure out what to do with those third-party solutions that might not be directly within the company's control, and there might be like a vendor management process, and they might be under contract for a number of years, where it might be a really difficult change to make.
No, your answer was helpful in that it's still worth documenting, it's still worth capturing.
Yeah,
because it's still worth surfacing to light, just because if you're being a good partner to a client, then it's worth thinking about, kind of like your whole thing, thinking about the customer journey holistically. So it's still worth documenting for sure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Follow-up question.
But let's say you were starting a company, or you're kind of building an app for the first time, and you scale up your organization and you start putting in those structures. How would you from the ground up kind of recommend keeping that level of nimbleness, so the left hand is talking to the right hand when it comes in regards to that customer journey? Do you create like a director of service design, or I don't know, you said it's a new field, but any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question that I think a lot of people are trying and experimenting with different things, different team structures to figure out. A lot of organizations that have been around for 100+ years are pretty baked into their structure, and it's pretty difficult to change. But a lot of organizations, think like tech companies or startups that are at a certain stage of maturity that have grown very quickly. Those that have the time and attention to be intentional about it experiment with different things, different levels of autonomy within different teams. But there are probably others that are more well suited to speak to this than myself. I think that's the thing that everyone's still trying to figure out, is as you get to a scale where you need departments that own certain parts of the business, how do you prevent departments from becoming natural silos? And that's one where I think we as designers, especially when we take a service design mindset, can help to connect those silos, because the customer doesn't care about your organization's silos. It's all one experience to them. They don't care that this doesn't work because customer service isn't talking to sales. They just see a broken experience. But that's where we as designers can play a part in highlighting where this internal disconnect is creating friction for the customer.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer to that. If I did, I'd write a book on it, you know.
Maybe some partners at High Alpha might be able to advise at the happy hour.
Oh,
Hey, there you go. Yeah.
Okay.
That was like a wonderful session. Thank you for that. And like as service design, like I first when I did learn about more about service design, it also dealt with the physical spaces, like applying service design for the whole physical space. So have you had any opportunity to like use service design for like in the physical space, like in like considering hospitality service or like in the airlines or something like that? So I want to know like more on that experience of you, since I'm more interested in that part.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a great question. I have less experience than some in terms of getting down to the design of a physical space, as we're designing across channels. Oftentimes that is in such a space agnostic way when we're thinking of like global distributed clients, that they don't often have that physical space. But there are a couple occasions where we've as part of considering that overall experience, made recommendations about because for example, with some clients in healthcare, they obviously need a physical space unless they're telehealth. But in those situations, because we knew the values of the brand that they wanted to convey, we had done research, so we know how people are feeling when they need to go see a specialist for this kind of procedure or evaluation. We knew that the space needed to one, and no surprise here, be very calm and soothing and welcoming. What healthcare experience doesn't need to meet those values, but also that the wayfinding and simplicity of getting around the space needed to be really clear for this particular demographic and their needs. And so because of that, we were able to design some really clear physical aspects of the space, signage and otherwise, that helped to accommodate those values of what we knew the brand and the experience needed to entail into the physical design of the space. Does that answer part of your question? So I guess, two-part. One, I have less experience on that physical space side of things, but it is a great opportunity to connect how that physical space shows up to the values that need to show up along that whole journey that you're designing.
Yes, I mean, like there are like many number of touch points comes up, like when you just talk about like physical space, that's like when you talk about like product design and like digital products and like physical space. So it's like a different way of like taking approach of like service design and applying that philosophy and that design method into it. So yeah, I was just curious, like how would you like answer that question? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thanks.
Justin, I could add some color on that.
Yeah, please do.
So I work for a grocery company that you probably know, and so I'm in the supply chain and manufacturing division, and I'm working, like one of my projects is to reduce the printed label waste, but I'm in the technology division of the supply chain, because operations meaning like the business people that have the purse strings, they're like saying this is costing millions to just print trash that's used once. We know that we can have a permanent solution. We're doing this to save millions. The tech team, meaning me and my product manager, get to figure out how that manifests. So we weren't given a lot of guidance, and it was up to us to bridge those connections and have that service blueprint to say, you know, here's physically what's happening in the space. Here's physically what changes. Like the label has a lot of unique information. When you go to a permanent, like unique to the order and the specific, even the specific bag and the contents, like that would be specific to the label that's now specific to this order. And now we're removing all of that context that's used in the associates doing their job and making decisions quickly. So we had to, now we're in supply chain. Now we have to talk to the associate experience team. And now there's potentially a customer experience on the outcome end. And now we also have to talk to associate training. And like, so it just keeps expanding based on how we've outlined the service of the physical paired with a digital companion, and then the experience along the way for all of our stakeholders becomes very important to map on a service blueprint, for example. And then we had to rapidly test. So we couldn't even test the real digital product because you need working software to do that. Right. Right. So there was like a month of just secondary research, like interviews with stakeholders and mapping the space to even be able to create the understood experience as we know it, to understand what might go wrong, to build prototypes for different stages that we could then Wizard of Oz and mock in the real life setting. So it was, there was so many, like, it was 2 studies, but we did maybe 8 different experiments within those studies based on the service stage. So being able to silo yourself out and like isolate your variables, right? This is research. Now we're getting into science. Like the more you can isolate a variable, I'm diverging, but we had to isolate the physical and the digital first before we could marry them, and then marry the experience and understand each iteration along the way. So I hope that helps a little bring clarity. And that you're always a bridge between teams.
Yeah, well said. It's a great example. Anyone else? Hey, we've got a raised hand. Samesh, go ahead.
Hey, yeah. Thank you again, Justin, for the presentation. There were definitely a lot of things in there that resonated with me and experiences I've had, and I especially, so I'm wondering if you or anyone here that has experience can speak more to maybe some best practices or like lessons learned when it comes to sort of presenting those things that happen in between the touch points, as you said, where the user just sort of falls between the cracks with something odd or you know, and I just find like those things are very awkward sometimes to present in a meeting with a lot of different departments, you know, because it's sort of like a lot of times the user journey kind of stuff is just sort of happens at the beginning of the design process, and then there's some sort of hand waving between the steps, and then it sort of gets into implementation, and then you know, if there is user testing, it's a lot of times it just sort of takes off into like, okay, the marketing department wants to know about click through, and you know, there's A/B testing for this feature, but then like, you know, if you're, you know, this is so a lot of what you said really resonated with me, because it's sort of like I have to, you know, if I do want to, if I'm noticing, like I'm in one sort of department, but I'm noticing the bigger like kind of the holistic journey is there's roadblocks and problems there, and it's sort of, and like if you try to present that to a lot of different stakeholders, sometimes like it's hard to even say what the problem is, because it's sort of like, oh yeah, so then the user does this, and they're presented with a page with a completely different style, even though it's a similar color to the last page, and they're like, well, what do you mean? This is what they're supposed to, sort of like, but like it's like just very awkward to guide people along through every thing that happens, so that they understand that there's like a bigger holistic problem, like I guess if you have any ideas for like how to present that in a kind of I don't know, it's just a way that just seems more actionable than just like the user is just just dragging through a swamp of like 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 ill-defined problems, I guess, or just, or yeah, yeah, I know that's like kind of a broad question that doesn't probably doesn't make a lot of sense, because I'm speaking to like specific experiences, but I'm not really giving the details. But but yeah, I don't know if you or anyone can can talk about like just presenting the user, the user research, and for like the service design aspect.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from others as well. What's worked best for everyone. I think depending on your audience, right? I don't want to put all let's say all executive stakeholders even in the same bucket and assume they all care about the same things. Hope I'm getting an echo. Probably, you mind muting the studio science one. Oh, we're good now. Okay, I think we're good now. Never mind. It was just a temporary thing. So this is where I think is that careful art of combining storytelling and data, right? So to help your audience empathize with what the customer is going through, to tell it as a story. And this can take a little bit of time. It's not going to, it might be a careful balance with the succinctness of the presentation, but I think really framing it up as their journey, telling a story of what they're experiencing, putting a face and a name to it, even using some visuals to aid in that storytelling. And then also where you can balance that out, because it'd be easy for someone to say like, hey, great story. But is this really a big problem amongst our user base? If we've got a million people that we care about on this journey, how much is this really affecting? So to be able to then point to data of like, hey, this is where we conducted research and found out that this issue that we are using, Jane to illustrate in this example scenario, this is actually happening to 10% of our users, happened to thousands and thousands of our users. And if it is, like you said, some of those in between touch points spaces, it can sometimes be more difficult to gather that quantitative data, because sometimes those are the things that are not happening digitally, and so it's harder to measure with that kind of hard data. But this is where starting the research with that in mind of, what do we need to figure out, and what data do we need to support it to convince people this is an issue, can be really helpful. But yeah, I'll stop there. Anybody else have examples of tactics and strategies that have worked for you?
Thank you.
Okay, hey Samesh. I was speaking, but we were on mute. So,
Okay.
So I just wanted to give the anecdote, or just whatever, like you're dealing with people, right? Like people are in your organization the departments are made up of people. If you've mapped out this service and you understand, like, there's context that you don't have from these other teams that are working on similar or parallel things, like, you can reach out to them. Like, you have internal channels to do that, and they're probably gonna at least respond with something. And when you do that, make sure you know what you're trying to gain out of that conversation too, because a lot of people, like, if you're doing any kind of research, they're not necessarily going to be forthcoming. So ask pointed questions, like, once you've established that relationship, like, in some specific way, like, have you done any research, or do you have any reports that have that are around this specific topic, or do you have any insights from this specific type of project? And you're likely to learn a lot and bridge boundaries there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
But I just went through like that whole ERP workshop and getting all those folks together. One of the reasons we even kind of came together, not just to identify our problems, but to also kind of create an SBAR for executives. So again, not to harp on executives, but I think at least for ours, their priorities were what's called our promise dashboard goals. So if you were coming saying, hey, there's a little leaky faucet over here that I want to fix, if it didn't have a direct impact on one of those 4 goals, it was not going to be a priority. And we had an opportunity to kind of really address our issues with kind of the design of communication across the organization, because one of the results in a wellness survey kind of came back saying that there's a desire, just in the open written section, so it wasn't even a question, for better communication with managers and with HR on these topics. And so we're like, this is our opportunity to kind of say, hey, this will lead to increased outcomes for this survey, which impacts this specific goal. But as a team, we kind of had to not only just help come together to understand one another's context, but to also say, how do we put on our non-MBA hats, our MBA by Google, and figure out how do we make a business case for why this should be a priority right now at this time.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Tie it to the money and the goal.
Thank you all.
Yeah, great question. Anyone else? I know we've got a little bit of time left, and I'll also want to give people a chance to wrap things up and have some conversation in the space there as well. So totally up to you all. I'm good to stay on, answer as many questions as anyone has.
So you did say people could reach out to you if they wanted to connect. We're also on Slack. So many of you might have found us through the Indy Design Slack. If you're not a member, you can join very easily by bit.ly/Slack Indy Design. So simple. Or find us on Meetup. We're out there. Well, Justin, thank you so much for being a trooper and presenting virtually, for being a great co-leader, organizing this event.
Yes, thank you so much for being there in person. Thank you, all of you, for being there in person. But Bobby, thank you for wheeling me around on some kind of contraption so I can see and hear people. And still, okay, nice. Yeah. I'm glad to see that thing's still getting some use. That was about a mobile device.
It was a plant stand immediately before that.
No, but seriously, thank you for coordinating and making everything happen in person there. Hybrid stuff is tough, but I appreciate everybody being flexible with us as we figured out. And again, sorry I couldn't be there with you all in person. Looking forward to seeing you all at the next IXDA meeting.
We'll have one next month. So, I mean, in theory.
Sounds good. Well, thank you all again. And yeah, like Paddy said, be happy to connect with anyone. Looking forward to catching up or making a new connection. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.